Picture this. There's a guy, a photographer, who walks into a bank like it's just another day at the office. Nothing weird, right? He's got his camera, probably snapping a few pictures. But then, out of nowhere, the bank realizes they're missing $108.43 million. Gone. And here's the crazy part. No one even saw it happen. Meet Albert Spaggiari. A guy who wasn't just good at taking pictures, he was a mastermind at pulling off one of the most insane bank heists in history. And he did it without breaking a sweat. Stick around, because I'm about to tell you the most amazing heist in history. But before that, make sure you've subscribed to our channel. Alright, so let's start with Albert Spaggiari. Who was this guy? Because honestly, when you think criminal mastermind, you're not exactly picturing a guy walking around with a camera around his neck, right? But that's what makes this story so wild. Spaggiari was born in 1932 in a little town called Heists, down in southern France. Now, growing up in post-war France wasn't easy, and like a lot of people back then, he had to find his way. So, what does he do? He picks up a camera and starts making a living as a photographer. Weddings, landscapes, maybe even some artsy shots of baguettes. It is France after all. The guy was just your everyday photographer, blending into society like a cup of coffee in a Paris cafe. But there was more to him than met the eye. Spaggiari wasn't just some quiet, artsy guy with a lens. He had ambition. And let's be honest, photography isn't exactly the get-rich-quick path. So somewhere along the line, he starts dipping his toes into the world of petty crime. Not exactly the most glamorous, but hey, it paid more than photo shoots. Still, even with his criminal connections, no one ever pegged him as someone who would go full Danny Ocean on a bank vault. But Spaggiari wasn't just after small time scores. He wanted something bigger. Something that would not only make him rich but would also leave a mark, something legendary. Here's where things start getting really interesting. Albert Spaggiari didn't just wake up one morning and decide, hey, I'm gonna rob a bank today. Nah, this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. The man planned this heist for months, and the level of detail he went into was pure genius. So, here's the deal. Spaggiari's target was the Société Générale in Nice, France. Not exactly the easiest place to rob, right? This bank had some of the tightest security around. But like I said, Spaggiari had an eye for detail. After all, he was a photographer. And what do photographers do? They notice things, small things that most people would miss. Over several months, Spaggiari scoped out the bank. Now, to the security guards, he was just some guy snapping pictures of the building. No big deal. But in reality, he was gathering critical information: how the vault worked, where the cameras were, and most importantly, the building's weakest point. And boy, did he find one. The vault, with all its state-of-the-art security systems, had a fatal flaw: the sewers. That's right, the bank was built on top of the city's sewer system, which meant if someone could get into the sewers, they could access the vault from underneath. And guess who figured that out? Yup, our guy Spaggiari. Alright, so now Spaggiari knew how he was going to get into the vault. But let's be real here, he couldn't pull this off on his own. This wasn't a one-man job. So what does he do? He assembles a crew. And not just any crew, he needed experts. Think of it like a criminal version of Ocean's 11, only with fewer tuxedos and more grime. Spaggiari recruited some of the best people for the job. We're talking tunnel diggers, lockpickers, and guys who knew how to navigate through underground sewer systems like it was their day job. These weren't amateurs. They were pros who knew exactly how to get in and get out without leaving a trace. Now, here's the thing about Spaggiari. He wasn't just smart, he was patient. He didn't rush into this. He waited for the perfect moment. And that moment came during Bastille Day weekend in July 1976. For those of you unfamiliar, Bastille Day is a massive holiday in France. Think 4th of July, but with more berets and wine. During the holiday, the bank would be closed for several days, which gave Spaggiari and his crew plenty of time to do their thing. With the bank out of commission for the weekend, they had about 48 hours to break into the vault, grab everything they could, and disappear before anyone even noticed something was wrong. Genius, right? Alright, so now we get to the good part, the heist itself. How did they pull it off? And more importantly, how did they manage to steal $108.43 million without setting off a single alarm? So, on the night of July 16, 1976, Spaggiari and his crew made their move. Armed with tools and a whole lot of guts, they entered the Nice sewer system. Now, if you're picturing something like the clean, shiny tunnels from a spy movie, think again. This was a sewer, dark, damp, and well, gross. But these guys weren't afraid to get dirty. They navigated the tunnels beneath the city, making their way to the exact spot under the bank vault. Once they were there, they began the delicate process of breaking through the vault's floor. This wasn't some smash-and-grab job. No, this was methodical. They drilled and chipped away at the floor, carefully avoiding setting off any alarms. When they finally broke through, they climbed up into the vault like they had just arrived at the promised land. And what did they find? Rows and rows of safe deposit boxes, filled with cash, gold, jewelry, basically a treasure trove. And here's the wild part. They didn't just grab what they could and run. No, these guys took their time. They spent hours going through the boxes, picking out the most valuable items and carefully packing them up. In fact, they were so relaxed about it that Spaggiari even left a note behind for the bank sans arms. Ni haine, ni violence, which translates to without weapons. Nor hatred, nor violence. It was like he was saying, thanks for the loot. No hard feelings. After cleaning out the vault, Spaggiari and his crew slipped back into the sewers and disappeared into the night. By the time the bank opened again after the holiday, they were long gone. And the best part, no one had a clue what had happened. The vault was untouched. The alarms hadn't gone off, and the security cameras hadn't seen a thing. It was like the money had just vanished into thin air. Now, you're probably wondering what happened next. Well, when the bank staff came back to work and realized that over $108 million was missing, all hell broke loose. The police were called, and an investigation was launched, but they had no leads. The heist was so clean, so perfectly executed, that they didn't even know where to start. Eventually, though, the police caught a break. They managed to track down some of the guys from Spaggiari's crew, and through them, they were able to connect the dots back to him. Spaggiari was arrested and charged with masterminding the heist, but here's the thing, he wasn't done being a genius just yet. While awaiting trial, Spaggiari managed to pull off one of the most audacious escapes you'll ever hear about. During a meeting with his lawyer, he jumped out of a third-story window in the courtroom and landed on a parked car below. He then hopped on a waiting motorcycle and sped off into the distance, never to be seen again by the authorities. Despite a massive manhunt, Spaggiari was never caught. He fled to South America, where he lived under various aliases until his death in 1989. The man lived out the rest of his days as a free man, while the authorities were left scratching their heads. Albert Spaggiari's heist remains one of the most legendary robberies of all time. It wasn't just about the money, although, let's be real, $108.43 million is nothing to sneeze at. It was the way he did it. No guns, no violence, just brains and a whole lot of guts. Even today, Spaggiari's heist is still talked about. It's been the subject of books, documentaries, and movies. People are fascinated by how he pulled it off, and honestly, who wouldn't be? Now, let me take you back to the moment when the news of Albert Spaggiari's heist broke. Imagine you're just going about your day, reading the newspaper or watching the news, and suddenly, bam, there it is. Photographer robs bank, steals $108.43 million without a trace. People were losing their minds. This wasn't just another robbery, this was something entirely different. The sheer scale of the heist, the flawless execution, and the fact that no one saw it coming. It was the kind of story that made headlines not just in France, but around the world. And let's be real, who doesn't love a good heist story? It's like something straight out of a thriller movie, except this time it was all real. The media went absolutely wild with it. Journalists couldn't get enough. They painted Spaggiari as a kind of Robin Hood figure, a guy who stole from the wealthy bank without using violence, almost like a gentleman thief. Some called him a criminal mastermind, others a folk hero. And what about the bank? They were left with egg on their face. How could a photographer, not some hardened criminal, outsmart one of the most secure banks in France? The media latched onto this, and for weeks it dominated headlines. People were fascinated not just by the crime itself, but by the man behind it. It's easy to see why people were so captivated by Spaggiari's story. Think about it. This wasn't your typical violent robbery where someone stormed in with guns blazing. No, this was a meticulous, well-thought-out operation. It had all the elements of a great story, a brilliant plan, an underdog protagonist, and a huge payday. And let's not forget, Spaggiari wasn't caught right away. Oh, that added to the intrigue. He vanished like a ghost, leaving the media and the public guessing. Who was this guy? How did he pull it off? Where did he go? Now, here's where things get interesting. Not everyone saw Spaggiari as a villain. To some, he was almost a hero. After all, he didn't use violence or harm anyone. The note he left behind in the vault, without weapons, nor hatred, nor violence, reinforced the idea that he was different from other criminals. The French public, always a bit rebellious at heart, admired his defiance. He didn't just rob a bank, he outsmarted the system, and that resonated with a lot of people. But of course, not everyone was on board with glorifying a bank robber. The authorities were fuming, and the bank was embarrassed. They wanted to paint Spaggiari as a cold-blooded criminal who needed to be brought to justice. But for the public, he became a legend. And let's be honest, who doesn't secretly root for the mastermind in these stories? This wasn't just a French story. It went global. Newspapers from London to New York were covering the heist, speculating about how it had been pulled off and what kind of person could execute such a flawless plan. Spaggiari became an international sensation, and for a while it seemed like everyone was talking about this invisible mastermind who had stolen millions and then disappeared without a trace. Now, let's talk about the fallout. Imagine being Société Générale, the bank that just got ripped off for $108.43 million. You've got one of the most sophisticated security systems in place, but a group of guys managed to crawl through the sewers and take your money without tripping a single alarm. Embarrassing doesn't even begin to cover it. The Société Générale was in full-on damage control mode. The first thing they had to do was face the public and their customers. Remember, this wasn't just some random cash. There were people's valuables in those safe deposit boxes. Families lost heirlooms, businesses lost important documents, and suddenly the bank's reputation was in tatters. Here's the thing: before the heist, Société Générale was considered one of the most secure banks in France. They had invested heavily in top-of-the-line vaults, advanced alarms, and 24/7 surveillance. But after the heist, it became painfully clear that they had underestimated one major flaw: their vulnerability from below. Spaggiari had exploited something the bank's engineers had never considered: the sewer system. And once that was public knowledge, other banks around the world started getting nervous. Could their vaults be vulnerable in the same way? The answer was yes, and it sent a shockwave through the entire banking industry. In the wake of the heist, Société Générale had to take drastic measures. First, they overhauled their security protocols. They started reinforcing their vaults, literally from the ground up. No one was taking any chances with the sewers anymore. They also upgraded their surveillance systems, making sure they had eyes not just on the doors and the vault, but on the surrounding areas, including any underground access points. But the damage was done. The bank had been humiliated on a global scale, and it took years to recover its reputation. In fact, some might say that the robbery forever changed how banks thought about security. It wasn't just about fancy alarms and vaults. It was about anticipating the unexpected. In a world where most heists end with someone getting caught, Spaggiari managed to outsmart the system and live out the rest of his life on his own terms. So, what's the takeaway here? Albert Spaggiari was more than just a photographer. He was a mastermind. A guy who saw an opportunity, planned it out to the smallest detail, and pulled off one of the most incredible bank heists in history. And the best part, he did it without ever being seen. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more amazing heists, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. And hey, if you've got any thoughts or questions, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching.